Thanks very much, Tim. So my name's Aaron McInnes. I'm from Curtin University in WA. I'll be talking about some work titled Pre-Movement Inhibition Protects Motor Actions from Interference. So about 100 milliseconds prior to the initiation of movement, there is a ramp up of excitability of the corticospinal tract. However, prior to this ramp up of excitability, earlier in preparation, there is a paradoxical decrease of corticospinal excitability. And this is a phenomenon known as preparatory inhibition. So this figure shows an example of preparatory inhibition. It shows MEPs to single pulse TMS, and all the way on the left is excitability at rest. And as you move along the x-axis, we're getting closer in time to the initiation of movement. And about 200 milliseconds before movement onset, we see that suppression of corticospinal excitability, and that is preparatory inhibition taking place. So this inhibition has been observed ubiquitously among a wide range of motor tasks, particularly including self-paced movements. And it has therefore been suggested that this inhibition of the corticospinal tract is a necessary component of motor preparation. However, the neurophysiological function of this suppression is unclear. So we hypothesized that the central nervous system may not be able to engage in preparatory inhibition if the urgency to initiate movement is high and there is little time to engage in normal preparatory processes. This would suggest that preparatory inhibition is in fact not a necessary component of motor preparation. So we manipulated the urgency of an anticipatory movement by changing the amount of time that was available to prepare the movement. We examined corticospinal excitability by measuring the amplitude of MEPs, and we also examined the initiation and execution of movement by measuring the force of FDI abduction during the task. And we predicted that the suppression of the corticospinal tract would not be evident when urgency is high, and there is little time available to engage in motor preparation, whilst leaving the behavioral response unchanged. Here's the sequence of events. So participants were asked to perform abduction of the FDI in time with the intersection of a clock hand at the 12 o'clock position. And the speed of the clock sweeping was adjusted in order to manipulate the urgency of movement preparation. And we can also see the times at which we presented the magnetic stimulation. So it was either presented at rest before the clock began moving, and this was the baseline stimulus, or it was presented 250 milliseconds prior to movement onset, which was the probe stimulus. So in terms of the MEP amplitudes, when urgency was low and participants had 1400 milliseconds to prepare their movement, we saw that large suppression of the corticospinal tract, which is typically observed. However, when urgency was high and there was only 350 milliseconds to prepare movement, that suppression was not evident. We also calculated probe MEP amplitudes as a percentage of baseline amplitudes, which you can see on the right. And this indicated that MEP amplitudes in the high urgency condition were slightly facilitated, whereas inhibition was clear when urgency was low. And looking at the behavioral responses, interestingly, when urgency was low, peak force and vigor were enhanced in probe trials in comparison to trials where no stimulation was presented. However, when urgency to move was high and no corticospinal suppression could be observed, we saw the opposite effect on motor output. And in this situation, there was a decrease of peak force and vigor by the probe stimulus. So experiment 1 indicated that urgency impaired preparatory suppression, and we further noticed behavioral effects in the absence of preparatory inhibition, which we wanted to examine further in order to determine whether these effects were due to the stimulation of the corticospinal tract, or whether this was due to the accessory stimulation by the TMS coil's discharge. So we were kind of wondering whether the sound and feel of the TMS discharge may have provided intersensory facilitation effects, which could explain the behavioral effects we observed. So in a second experiment, we had a separate sample of participants perform a similar task, except a loud sound was presented instead of a TMS pulse. This had the added benefit in that we could examine any modulation of the startle response to the sound, which can provide an index of the excitability of subcortical circuits. Looking at the latency of the Startle-Blink, this mirrored the amplitude of the motor evoked potentials in experiment 1, where we saw a clear inhibition of subcortical circuits when urgency was low and no inhibition when urgency was high. However, the amplitude of the Startle-Blink was inhibited for all urgency conditions, although the magnitude of this suppression was decreased with increasing urgency. And again, looking at the behavioral effects, we saw similar effects to those in experiment 1. So we saw an enhancement of force and vigor when urgency was low, and this enhancement was impaired when urgency was high. So overall, this work showed that preparatory inhibition can be observed in both the corticospinal tract as well as in subcortical reflex circuits. This may suggest an initial global suppression acts on motor circuits, which later evolves into a more specified inhibition, which acts more focally on the corticospinal tract. We also showed that this preparatory inhibition is impaired when urgency to move is high, and this absence of corticospinal suppression has effects on the output of movements which are to be executed. Due to the fact we observed no evidence of corticospinal suppression during time-constrained preparation, we suggest that preparatory inhibition may be a strategy used during movement preparation rather than a necessity. Both TMS and the loud sound induce similar effects on behavioral responses, and due to the impairment of force and vigor induced by both the electromagnetic and acoustic stimulation in the absence of preparatory inhibition, we suggest that this strategic inhibition may serve to protect prepared movements from external interference by sensory stimuli. So thank you very much. And do we have any questions?
Thanks, Aaron. It's a great talk. I haven't seen any in the Q&A yet, so if you do have one, please pop it in there. I could ask one that I was really interested in, though. So you did test the pre-prepared inhibition at 250 milliseconds before movement, or the expected time of movement onset in experiment 1, and you didn't see any evidence that that was there was not much of it there basically when you had a high urgency. So do you think that maybe if you went a little closer to the onset, you could have seen that? And if you have, for example, a situation where the process of preparation is kind of condensed by the urgency, you might expect to go through the same sequence of events, but in a shorter period. Have you done any work where you've looked at different timings?
Yeah, yeah, we definitely considered that. I mean, for one, it is quite a short time frame, but it could be possible. So we're actually following that up at the moment, and we're looking closer to movement onset at 150 milliseconds. And yeah, we're seeing pretty much the same situation. We're actually getting more facilitation at that time point.